Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome to the very first online talk for ZSL Fellows of 2020. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for the taste of what is to be part of the eminent ZSL Fellowship Program. For those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Holly Bestley, one of the Senior Learning Officers here at ZSL. And this evening we are being joined by Professor Andrew Cunningham, Professor of Wildlife Epidemiology and Deputy Director of Science at ZSL's Institute of Zoology, which is the scientific research division of the Society based down at ZSL London Zoo. This evening, Andrew will be sharing his valuable insight into the global pandemic that we have all been experiencing over the last few months. Having spent much of his career studying diseases in wild populations, and particularly the conditions under which these diseases might jump from species to species, Andrew is uniquely placed to provide his expertise on emerging zoonoses. So over the next hour or so, we will explore the vital work of Andrew and the Institute of Zoology in identifying and investigating wildlife diseases, developing preventative health research, and how continued exploitation of the natural world could expose humanity to more dangerous threats in future. In a unique opportunity this evening, you will also be able to put forward your own questions to Andrew directly. This is the very first time that we have used this technology, so please be patient with us during the talk. But on both mobile devices and on a laptop, you should be able to see at the top of your screen two little speech bubbles with a question mark. If you click the bubble, you can put your question, type it directly in there, and we will put these to Andrew at the end of the talk. So, to get things kicked off this evening, I'm going to pass to Andrew, who is going to first off introduce himself and tell us a little bit about how he got to where he is in his career today, as it's something that lots of our student fellows have previously expressed an interest in. So, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Holly, and welcome to everybody this evening. So I've always wanted to work with wild animals since I was a little kid. And my parents tell me that when I was 3, I announced that I was going to either be a zookeeper or a vet. And I've pretty much stayed on that trajectory ever since. I can remember being very influenced by a series of books, adventure series of books by Willard Price on collecting animals for zoos. And then somebody gave me a present for my birthday, Birds, Beasts and Relatives, which was a book by Gerald Durrell. And I was completely hooked on the role that zoos could play for conservation and the problems that species were having in the modern world. Of course, things have got much worse since then for species. And I was toying up whether to do zoology or some sort of zoology degree or related degree, or what my real passion was, veterinary science. And I did go down the veterinary science route and graduated as a veterinary surgeon, spent a year in practice, and I chose a veterinary practice that had a private zoo on its books. So I maintained my interest in zoo and wild animals that way. And then I was very lucky that within a year of graduating, I landed the job of veterinary pathologist at ZSL. And that was in 1988, and I've been at ZSL ever since. While I was a veterinary pathologist, I did a part-time PhD on frog mortality in the UK and discovered a new virus, a ranavirus, which was killing frogs not just in the UK, but elsewhere in the world. And once I got my PhD, I was given the opportunity to go full-time into research, and I set up a wildlife disease research group in 2001. And we've basically grown from strength to strength ever since. And initially in my career, disease was not really seen to be that important for conservation or population demise. But I think things have changed a great deal in the last 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years. And now disease is seen, wildlife disease is seen as extremely important for biodiversity conservation and also for public health.
Great. Okay, so to get us started on the topic for this evening, my first question would be, what is the link between what's happening now around the world and this global pandemic and the state of biodiversity?
Right, well, as we know, the world is undergoing a global health crisis following the zoonotic emergence of COVID-19. That this has occurred at the same time the planet is undergoing a biodiversity extinction crisis is not a coincidence. Biodiversity conservation and safeguarding public health are inextricably linked through a range of complex ecological and socio-economic pathways. As the number of species decline, and as the population abundances of those remaining species decline, and that's perhaps even more important than the species loss, is the abundance loss. As those decline, the risk of zoonotic emergence increases. Now, you could think of it as our planet's biodiversity acting as a protective mechanism against human disease in a similar but more complex way as our intestinal biodiversity protects us against pathogen invasion through our gut. For example, the rich mosaic of species that occurs in undisturbed ecosystems inhibits opportunities for pathogens to build up into high numbers across animal populations, thus limiting the degree of human exposure to any particular wildlife pathogen. In addition, as people encroach into and modify natural habitats, the range of species, known as the species complement in that habitat, is changed. Human-modified habitat becomes less suitable for some species, but more suitable for others. And colleagues at the Institute of Zoology and University College London have recently found out that the species that are more able to live in human-modified habitats tend to have a higher rate of carriage of potentially zoonotic pathogens than those that decline or disappear from human-modified habitats. Hence, habitat modification and habitat destruction is a lose-lose situation when it comes to zoonotic emergence. Also, as biodiversity is a critical source of new veterinary and medical treatments, as we lose biodiversity, we lose out yet again when it comes to combating disease. Perhaps not surprisingly, therefore, studies by ZSL scientists and others have consistently shown that the rate of zoonotic pathogen spillover from wild animals has been increasing at an accelerating rate over recent decades, with significant zoonotic disease outbreaks causing major loss of life and economic devastation. Indeed, 75% of all new human diseases identified in recent years began as zoonoses, and many of these, including AIDS, SARS, MERS, Ebola, Hendra, Nipah, and now COVID-19, originated from wildlife either directly or via domestic animal intermediate hosts. The latest addition to this list, COVID-19, is caused by infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the Sars Coronavirus, Sars Coronavirus 2. This disease was first detected in Wuhan in China in December 2019, although as such a high proportion, some say up to around 70% of human infections have no or very mild symptoms. And as it can take some time to recognize the presence of a new disease, especially one that causes flu-like symptoms, it could have been circulating in the human population for some time before December 2019. The causative virus of COVID-19 is called Sars Coronavirus 2 because its genetic sequence is very close to that of the SARS virus, and the amino acid sequences of the two viruses have about 95% similarity. So far, SARS-related coronaviruses have only been found in bats, and during the COVID-19 pandemic, much has been made of the importance of wild animals, such as bats, as sources of pathogens that can jump into new species, including human beings. However, it's really important to remember that wild animals are not the problem. They don't cause disease emergence, people do.
Would you be able to elaborate a bit on how people are the cause of zoonotic disease emergence?
Yes, at the root of the problem is human behaviour. So changing human behaviour can actually be seen as a solution. So in order to understand which human behaviours and activities are risky and how they should be changed to minimise the risks of future novel zoonotic spillover events, research is required to understand the ecology of pathogens in their natural hosts. It's required to understand how humans and wildlife interact, both directly and indirectly. What are the impacts of environmental change? And how are all these components mediated by socioeconomic drivers? Understanding the complex ecological and socioeconomic factors associated with zoonotic disease emergence and spread therefore requires substantial investment in preventative zoonotic emergence research. Key to this understanding is developing a joined-up approach that combines expertise across the social, environmental, veterinary, and medical sciences. Now, some drivers of disease emergence are already known. Risky human behaviours, for example, can result from socioeconomic drivers that lead to new and increased human-wildlife interfaces, often with concurrent biodiversity loss. Examples include agricultural encroachment into wildlife habitat, road building with the opening up of forests for logging or mining, and the increased commoditisation of wildlife, along with the concomitant increasing reach of wildlife supply chains. Many drivers of biodiversity loss, such as land use change, encroachment into wildlife habitat, bushmeat hunting, and the trafficking of wild animals and their products, are often the same drivers as those of zoonotic disease emergence. Perhaps the prime example of human exploitation of wildlife is the sale of live wild animals in wet markets. These animals are taken from the wild, different species are brought together from different habitats, transported over large distances, and held for long periods in close confinement. Between capture and slaughter, they are stressed and immunosuppressed, and so are increasingly likely to excrete whatever pathogens they have in them, whilst also being increasingly vulnerable to infections they might not naturally encounter. Just like people, animals are usually infected with a range of pathogens, often at low levels of infection, which don't or rarely cause disease in their natural host in which the pathogen has evolved over millennia. Stress acts to suppress the immune system, allowing these pathogens to be expressed. You can think of an example in people, such as the cold sore virus, which most people harbour in a dormant or latent state without knowing it, but under certain circumstances of physiological stress, the virus becomes active, a cold sore develops, and the virus is expressed, excreted, and then transmitted to other people. So people who are in close contact with wild animals, with stressed wild animals, particularly if that contact is prolonged, and if they're in contact with the body fluids of these animals, they're more likely to be exposed to novel pathogens, creating the ideal circumstances for new diseases to emerge. The holding and trafficking of different animal species in close association with each other also exposes them to novel pathogens. And if a new species is successfully infected and becomes diseased, this facilitates the likelihood of zoonotic emergence, because such host species that have not co-evolved with a particular pathogen, such as a virus, they're often termed bridging or amplifier hosts. And this is because of an absence of co-evolved immunity or other adaptations to that virus. means that the new host, if successfully infected, is likely to become diseased. And a diseased animal, just as a person who's expressing a cold sore, a diseased animal can release large amounts of virus into the environment, thus hugely increasing the risk of human exposure to infectious doses and hence to zoonotic emergence. This is particularly the case for diseases caused by RNA viruses. RNA viruses have a much greater propensity to mutation and hence adaptation to new hosts than other types of pathogen. COVID-19, SARS, MERS, Ebola, Marburg, AIDS, Zika, Nipah, and Hendra are all examples of recently emerged zoonotic diseases from wildlife that are caused by RNA viruses. In addition, to just make things even worse, the more that RNA viruses replicate, the greater is the likelihood that they will develop mutations. So these bridging or amplifier hosts not only produce more virus, they increase the rate of production of virus mutants. Most of these virus mutants, most of these mutations will be neutral or deleterious to the virus, so they won't have any impact at all. However, occasionally a mutation occurs that results in a virus becoming better adapted to its host, or possibly better adapted to infecting another new host, such as human beings. You can think of it as a game of chance at each stage of the zoonotic emergence process. With COVID-19, the virus circulating in Europe and the USA today is actually genetically different from the one that emerged in Wuhan last year. The current virus appears to be better adapted to infecting human beings and has therefore outcompeted its progenitor. This latest iteration of SARS-CoV-2 appears to be better at transmitting between people, although not necessarily any different in its virulence once a person has been infected. When natural hosts are infected but not diseased by a virus they have co-evolved with, the number of virus copies in that host can be extremely small, sometimes too small for us to find, even with modern molecular techniques such as next-generation sequencing or PCR. In these cases, zoonotic emergence risk is very low, even if handling an animal that is infected. And this might explain why it can often be so difficult to pinpoint the source of zoonotic viruses once an emergence event has occurred. For example, after almost 20 years of virus hunting, we still haven't found the source of the SARS virus that emerged in 2002, although we have found a range of other closely related coronaviruses, SARS-related viruses, in rhinolophid or horseshoe bats, which suggests that a species of horseshoe bat is the natural host of the SARS coronavirus that caused the pandemic in 2002. And that's why it's thought most likely that the COVID-19 virus also has a species of horseshoe bat as its natural host, although this has not yet been confirmed. Like COVID-19, SARS was thought to have spilled over to people from wild animals trafficked for human consumption when masked palm civets, in the case of SARS, were identified as the bridging host. If a bridging host was involved for COVID-19, that has not yet been found.
So given these mysteries around the origin of these viruses, does this mean that we should just be calling for a ban, sort of an all-out ban on wildlife trade in general?
Yeah, well, there have unmistakably been calls for a ban on wildlife trade and for the closure of live animal or wet markets. However, these actions are likely to just be short term. For example, wet markets were closed after the SARS pandemic in 2002, 2003, but they didn't stay closed for very long. And one reason for that is that that such an outright ban has the potential to be damaging because it moves the wildlife trade into illegal markets where the capacity to enforce regulations is extremely challenging. Now, it's bad enough as it is, and I think we can do a much better job globally with enforcing regulations. But if everything was banned and wet markets were illegal, then it would be even worse. And the reason for that is that for as long as people rely on wild animal meat, to meet their nutritional needs, and millions of people still do, bushmeat hunting and the wildlife meat trade will continue. So what is needed is greater regulation of the wild animal trade, particularly the commercial wild animal trade. Unfortunately, despite the occasional news expose, this commercial trade is still rather poorly understood. And there's a real need to get a much better handle on how extensive it is. For example, what species are being trafficked, to what degree, and how many of which species are trafficked alive? Where are wild animals being hunted? Where is the ultimate point of sale, and what are the trade routes? In 2008, I was involved with a small pilot study with some colleagues at the Institute of Zoology here at ZSL to investigate the smuggling of bushmeat into Europe from Central and West Africa through Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. Almost half of the 134 passengers who were searched from those flights were found to be illegally carrying meat or fish, including entire sheep and even an entire calf. Somebody had an entire calf in their hold-all that they had taken in as cabin luggage. Only 7% of searched passengers were found to be carrying bushmeat, but the average size of those bushmeat consignments were much higher than the size of the consignments people were bringing in that were made up of livestock or fish. For example, the average size of the bushmeat consignments was 20 kilograms, compared with 4 kilograms for livestock and 9 kilograms for fish. We think this indicated that while livestock and fish were being illegally imported mostly for personal use, wild meat was being imported on a commercial basis. And we estimated that around 5 tons of bushmeat per week was being smuggled in personal baggage through this one European airport. And a wide range of species were found, including many which are CITES listed, such as primates, elephant, pangolin, and even crocodile.
I mean, those figures are quite astounding. If the situation with human behaviour doesn't change and these issues continue, is COVID-19 the worst? How are we seeing the worst case scenario for a pandemic originating from wildlife? I'm afraid the answer to that is probably not, Holly. I mean, COVID-19 has been devastating, and its estimated case fatality rate that's the number of people who die versus the number of people who get sick from infection. That case fatality rate has been estimated at between 1% and 3%, but the data are very poor and they've been collected in different ways in different countries. But what between 1% and 3% is, I mean, it's high compared to seasonal flu, but actually it's quite low compared to some other diseases that we know of. So while COVID-19 has caused a major threat to public health, and the scale of the clinical challenge really must not be underestimated, our continued exploitation of the natural world does expose humanity to some much more dangerous diseases. Of those we know about, Ebola, for example, kills around 50% of those infected, and Nipah virus around 60%, rising to 100% in some outbreaks. In Bangladesh, there is a new emergence of Nipah on an almost annual basis.
And each time a human outbreak occurs, we're giving the virus a chance to mutate and adapt better to human beings. Now, we already know of outbreaks of Nipah virus in Bangladesh with multiple human-to-human transmission cycles. But fortunately, so far, the R0, or the reproduction number, which we're probably all very familiar with now after seeing all the press conferences on COVID-19, the R0 of Nipah has always been below 1. So each outbreak has fizzled out. But like flu and SARS CoV-2, COVID-19, Nipah virus can be spread by the respiratory route. So it's no wonder that it's on the World Health Organization's watch list as a possible future pandemic. But can you imagine what it would be like if COVID-19 had a case fatality rate of 60+%? Now, those are ones that we have on the radar because we know about them. They've emerged before, and some of them, like Ebola and Nipah, emerge periodically. We know that around 260 viruses from 25 viral families in mammals and birds are zoonotic. But it is estimated that in these hosts, from these what we can call high-risk viral families, there are around 700,000 viruses with zoonotic potential that have not yet been discovered. So each time zoonotic infection occurs, there is a chance that the virus will mutate to become better adapted to human transmission, which might involve a virus becoming more virulent because increased virulence increases lesions, and viruses are excreted and spread via lesions and symptoms such as cold sores or coughs and sneezes.
Very concerning stuff. So linking back though to something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, you've mentioned that a few zoonotic diseases have mostly come from bats. Are bats special in that regard? We hear a lot about bats in the news as being the potential kind of origin of COVID, but are they a unique group in their in having a lot of these zoonotic potential diseases?
Well, zoonotic diseases can emerge from virtually any animal species. But there do appear to be some taxonomic groups that are higher risk than others. And the ones that appear to be of the highest risk when it comes to zoonotic disease emergence are novel zoonotic disease emergence. I'm not talking about things like Salmonella and Campylobacter here. I'm talking about things like Ebola and Hendra and Nipah and COVID-19. The high risk ones appear to be things like non-human primates, rodents and bats. Now we think that primates, in the case of primates, it's mostly due to their phylogenetic relatedness to human beings, so that if something can infect one primate, it's more likely to then be able to infect another primate, such as a person. With rodents and bats, it's probably mostly due to the vast numbers of species in these groups. Of the approximately 5,500 known species of mammal in the world, around 2,200 are rodents and 1,200 are bats. So that's over half the known mammal species in the world. For comparison, there are around about 200 species of primate. So the greater the number of species, it's just a numbers game, the greater the number of species in a taxonomic group, the more zoonotic or potentially zoonotic pathogens is likely to be carried by that group. However, in recent decades, bats do appear to have been particularly important hosts for novel zoonotic viruses. And it's been hypothesized that this is linked to their ability to fly. Bats are the only mammals capable of true flight. And there have been several hypotheses, or many hypotheses put forward for this. And some of them have been tested to some degree, but none of them have yet been fully tested. So one hypothesis is that by flying, that basically increases the effective population size of many species of bat. And so if you think about it, bats are in roosts. Some roosts are small numbers of bats, maybe just 3s, 4s, 10s, 20s, and some roosts are in hundreds of thousands or even millions. But when bats fly, particularly fruit bats flying to common feeding grounds, bats from different roosts will mix, and often they return not to the same roost. So there's a lot of mixing across very, very large areas, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers on an almost daily or nightly basis. And that increases the effective population size. And with an increased effective population size, there is a higher ability to carry a larger number of viruses. These viruses can circulate within large populations better than they can persist in small populations. So it's thought that maybe that's one reason why bats carry such a large number of viruses than say animals that are restricted to terrestrial groupings. Then when bats fly, their metabolic stresses are extremely high. Flight induces high metabolic stress, and so bats have various physiological adaptations related to cell repair that might enable them to host virulent viruses, so that they can repair the damage done by the viruses before they get sick or die. And therefore, that may be another reason why bats are able to host a larger complement of viruses than terrestrial mammals in the absence of disease. Another hypothesis is that bats have developed a better innate immune system, or have a better antiviral genetic toolbox, if you like, compared to other mammals. And it's recently been shown, and there's a preprint up on bioRxiv about this, that bat cells contain different forms of a protein called tetherin. And it's different to the protein tetherin that's found in terrestrial mammals. And more so than that, some species of bat have actually multiple structural variants of this tetherin protein, whereas terrestrial mammals usually just have one variant, one form of this protein. And tetherin is an important part of the innate immune system, which inhibits the release of enveloped viral particles from cells and from the cells in which they are produced. So it could be that bats have this could be just one component of a better innate system for dealing with viruses. Is that when bats fly, we know that their body temperature increases, and it increases to a much greater degree than, say, animals' body temperatures do when they run or when they swim, for mammals. And this spike in body temperature when bats are flying mimics fever in terrestrial mammals. So viruses that are adapted to infecting bats will have developed a resistance to high body temperature. So they will have developed a resistance to fever, and fever is a really important innate immune response in terrestrial mammals, because most pathogens that infect terrestrial mammals cannot replicate well or even die in the presence of fever. And that's why we get fever when we get sick. And this might be why bat viruses tend to be particularly virulent if they can successfully infect terrestrial mammals, such as human beings, because they are not inhibited by our body's response, our body's febrile response to the infection. And the last hypothesis that I want to talk about is that the increased zoonotic emergence from bats could be, at least in part, a consequence of increased human-bat contact in recent decades. And this is possibly because bats are increasingly being targeted as bushmeat following the decline of traditionally hunted species. So as the larger species have been hunted to extinction or near extinction, people have then hunted the next largest and the next largest. And these days, we're down to hunting bats. And it does seem that bats, although they have always probably been widely eaten as bushmeat around the world, that the extent to which they are hunted now and the extent to which that brings people into direct contact with live bats and with the body fluids of butchered bats has increased in recent decades. So this preponderance of bats as sources of lethal zoonotic viruses has led to sporadic calls, cull them. For example, in 2012, following Ebola and Marburg outbreaks in Uganda, that country's Minister of Tourism called for all bats to be culled. While in 2011, an Australian state premier called for fruit bats to be culled following outbreaks of Hendra virus. Although bats do carry many potentially zoonotic viruses, they are also essential for ecosystems to function, and they themselves provide ecosystem services to humankind. For example, in 2011, there was a paper published in Science on the economic value of insectivorous bats to agriculture in the USA, where it was estimated that they provide non-toxic pest control services of approximately $23 billion a year. Now, that was in 2011. While fruit bats pollinate trees and spread their seeds, and such is the importance of fruit bats in this respect, that their removal would not only reduce yields of commercially important fruits, but would lead to a loss of tropical forests as we know them, and hence all the biodiversity that's reliant on them would also be lost or changed, as would the forest ecosystem services, such as the provision of fresh water and the prevention of soil erosion. But perhaps another convincing argument against culling bats is that in doing so, if we do cull bats, we tend to alter the epidemiology of the pathogen infection within the populations of bats, which increases the likelihood of zoonotic disease spillover. For example, the Marburg outbreak that so vexed that Ugandan tourism minister was found to be a direct result of culling Rosetta's fruit bats that were roosting in a mine. Prior to the cull, the prevalence of Marburg infection in these bats was 5%, but following culling, the returning survivors had an infection prevalence of over 13%. And these bats were infected with multiple strains of Marburg virus. So similar increases of infection prevalence and risk of zoonotic spillover have been found in other bat pathogen systems following culling, such as with rabies virus and vampire bats in Peru. So culling bats is not a good idea.
So if culling an origin species is not going to help at all, what do you think can be done to prevent the next pandemic emerging from wildlife?
Yes, so I think, we've got to remember that wild animals, just like humans, naturally carry a range of pathogens. And actually, this pathogen complement is an important component of biodiversity. And it's clear that human activities and behaviors, and not the wild animals themselves, are what causes the increased risks of and opportunities for zoonotic spillover. So how can we prevent the next pandemic? Well, I don't think we will ever be able to prevent a pandemic. First, I think it's important to understand that we won't be able to entirely prevent zoonotic spillover, but we can work to minimize the chances of zoonotic spillover from occurring. And some of the things that we already know that we need to do this include reducing the supply of the global supply chains, reducing the range of the supply chains of wildlife, of the wildlife trade. If we can reduce the distance that live animals or fresh wild animal products are transported over. For example, wild animals destined for slaughter should not be shipped alive internationally, where they're entirely stressed and have lots of opportunities for pathogen spillover. Uncooked wild animal meat, whether fresh or frozen, should ideally not cross national borders. And we should definitely not be shipping that between continents. Reducing the taxonomic reach of the live wildlife trade. So I've talked about what the high risk groups are, the Chiroptera, the Rodentia, the primates. I think we should be looking at banning trade in those groups, because we know those groups are higher risk than other taxonomic groups. We should not be allowing opportunities for bridging or amplifier hosts. So when animals are, wild animals, or even domestic animals are moved around or transported or traded, we need to decrease the opportunities for spillover between species, between wild animals and domestic animals, between wild animals and wild animals. So the co-housing or co-transportation of different wild and domestic animal species should be banned. And this is a particularly important preventative measure as the livestock farming intensification grows, both in numbers of farms, in numbers of animals held in these intensive farms, and in geographic spread. Because in addition to intensively farmed livestock acting as crucibles for pathogenic virus emergence themselves, which is a bit off-piste for this talk, but is another story, the ability of livestock to act as bridging hosts for zoonotic emergence from wildlife increases with intensification. And we can think of what happened in Malaysia in 1999, when Nipah virus first emerged on the scene as a zoonosis. Over 100 people died, and there was huge economic cost as the effective destruction of the Malaysian pig industry was required to bring about the outbreak, to bring that outbreak under control. And that outbreak occurred because of the movement, the growth of intensification of pig farms within Malaysia. We can be reducing other conditions that predispose to pathogen spillover. So if we are dealing with live animals, they should have the best possible welfare that we can provide them. Animals should be properly housed, fed and watered, given bedding and opportunities to hide. Stocking densities should be low. The time spent in transit or spent between capture and slaughter should be absolutely minimized as much as possible. Animals should be housed in hygienic conditions, and they should be slaughtered in hygienic conditions. While gaining a better understanding of the types of viruses, the high-risk locations, and the high-risk species, so that we can identify hotspots for zoonotic emergence, is an important way forward. We've already seen that there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of potentially zoonotic viruses that exist in wild animals, and we're not going to be able to develop vaccines or treatments for all of them. So we need to have a cleverer way of dealing with this. We need to have a much better understanding of the drivers and factors underlying zoonotic spillover and emergence, to understand the ecology of the pathogens in their natural wildlife hosts, how they are transmitted and persist in these hosts, and most importantly, what human activities and behaviours lead to zoonotic emergence and how these can be mitigated. This is where the research is really needed, and where it's not yet been focused or funded, despite events such as the emergence of a pandemic disease like COVID-19, not only being predictable, but having been predicted by disease ecologists working in this field for at least the past 20 years. So this requires the funding of a new research paradigm involving collaborations across really importantly, these have to be transdisciplinary across social sciences, ecology, disease ecology, veterinary science, medical science, virology, epidemiology, disease modelling, and others. In addition to the need for large project grants, of course, we're always asking for more money, but in addition to the need for large project grants, I believe that there's a real need for a new physical centre where these groups can come together, a centre for biodiversity and public health. This would physically bring this range of scientists together to ensure that such a research paradigm develops for the long term, not just during the period of a 3-year grant. And this would increase national and international capacity through training of postgraduate students, for example. And such a centre would be really important for ensuring that any increase or redirection of science funding into the area of zoonotic emergence is not just a knee-jerk flash-in-the-pan response to COVID-19, but has impact over the longer term.
Fantastic. So we're going to get on to the section of this evening where we have some questions that have been sent in by some fellows, some of them before today's event, and we've had some wonderful questions in the chat also, which we'll get to. Our first question that we had for you was from a gentleman called Ian, who has said that do you see reports expressing the concern for more aggressive diseases? Would you expect these to increase in frequency in the future? And if so, can we even predict where they might come from or where they would hit?
So as I think I said, I think of zoonotic emergence as a bit of a game of chance. And the more opportunities we give for zoonotic emergence, the more likely it's going to happen. And the more opportunities we give for highly virulent, nasty diseases to spill over, and not just to spill over, but to develop into effective human-to-human transmitting pathogens, will increase the more opportunities we give them. So I'm afraid my answer to Ian's question, the simplest answer is yes. There will undoubtedly be more zoonotic emergence events. I mean, after SARS, I really thought that was a huge wake-up call to the world. That was 20 years ago now. And initially, there was some grants and some wet markets were closed down. But after a year or two, everybody just went, you know, we got through it, it's over, and went on to business as usual. Well, this time we can't go back to business as usual. You know, we just can't do that because it will happen again. And who knows, the next one could be a hell of a lot worse than COVID-19.
You mentioned the word wake-up call, which links to a question that we've had from Dr. Peter Burgess, who has asked whether you consider the current COVID-19 pandemic a wake-up call for the human species to address particularly the ever-increasing issue of the global population.
Yes, yes. It can start getting controversial talking about human population, but actually we do have to recognise, I mean, we have to follow the science on this. Sound like Boris Johnson, don't I? We have to follow the science. We have to follow the science on this, and actually, as the human population has increased, that increases the chances of pandemic emergence. It's not just the increase in the human population size and the human population density, it's the connectedness of the human population. Now, we're a highly connected population through motorized transport and air travel. You can be in a jungle in Central Africa one day and commuting on the tube in Central London the next. And so this means that, I mean, zoonotic spillovers have happened almost certainly throughout the history of humanity. But now, rather than somebody getting sick and recovering, or getting sick and dying before they can get to a conurbation of people or a village or a town to pass it on to other people, these days the connectedness means that people will be in touch with other people much more, partly because of the increase in the human population, partly because of the increased connectedness. So yes, I think it's a good question, and we do have to take note of that.
Brilliant. We had another question that came up in the chat earlier from Andrew Heaver, who was asking that ecotourism has long been seen as the saviour of many threatened species. And do you think zoonotic risk means that this needs a rethink? Where do we draw the balance between the benefits and the risks in that kind of situation of people wanting to kind of go and see these animals in the wild?
So there's ecotourism and there's ecotourism. There's ecotourism, which stresses the hell out of the animals. People get too close, they prod and they poke and they want to catch and they want to hold and they want to have selfies with them and so on. And those are just asking for problems. Then there's ecotourism that's done correctly, and that may include wearing PPE. For example, there are caves, bat caves that people like to go and visit. And I think, you know, we should seriously be considering people wearing PPE when they're going into bat caves. And I mean, that's to protect people from the bats, but, you know, who knows, it could also be protecting the bats from pathogens that we carry. especially if COVID-19 becomes widely prevalent in humans who are asymptomatic, and then we go into bat cave and give it to bats in that bat cave in a different part of the world that COVID-19 naturally evolved in bats. I mean, that we don't know what would happen then. So yeah, I think ecotourism done correctly is a really good thing, and done correctly also means involving local people, so that local people benefit. They get the money. They're not just given a very minimum wage and all the profits go into a multinational company. It's, you know, so if you're going on ecotourism holidays, you want to look at who owns the company, is it locally owned, and what are the restrictions? I mean, people complain about not being allowed to get as close to the animals as they want, but there are very good reasons for that. And I think zoonotic emergence is another reason that probably hasn't been considered that much, but should be.
It kind of links through. We've had a question from Stephanie that mentions the blog that you wrote for the ZSL website, which is a fantastic thing that everybody should read after this talk if they get the moment to. But you do highlight in that the overuse of the overuse of natural resources, which will result in a more serious pandemic. So with lockdown and preventative measures across the world, have you noticed a change in attitudes to the understanding of these diseases and more interest yet into the research that might ultimately change our behaviour? Is that happening yet?
Oh, I hope so. But then I thought that in 2003 after SARS. And as I say, you know, people have very short memories. It's incredible. And I mean, I was even asked by a journalist when I was doing a media interview about COVID-19, saying, you know, there haven't been any previous pandemics. And God, there have been lots of pandemics from wildlife. So, you know, we have very short memories, and we really need to keep, it's only through public pressure on politicians and policymakers that things will be done. If they think they can get away with not doing anything, they won't do anything. So we've got to keep up the pressure on policymakers, on politicians to take note of the science. The science has been there for a long time. It's not something that's just bubbled up with COVID-19. It's been around for decades. So, you know, we really need to do something about it. I hope so, is my answer to that question.
Yes, I think we all hope so. We've had a couple of questions come through from different places about advice that you would have. I know that we've got some students watching from some student fellows as well, asking about kind of advice for pursuing a field that you're in now. Specifically, we've had one in the chat earlier that asked for some examples of roles for veterinary professionals in wildlife conservation. This is from a vet student who wants to work in conservation but can't seem to find the information that she needs. And I wondered just what advice you would have for people wanting to follow in your footsteps a bit.
Well, probably not following my footsteps, because my footsteps started when there were no professional conservation veterinarian roles, really, or very, very few, and they were really based just in zoos, whereas these days there's much more veterinary involvement with conservation in the wild, with free living wild animals. But having said that, a lot of what we do with free living wild animals, we've learned from working with animals in zoos. So, you know, zoo veterinarian work is extremely important, both for the conservation work, for maintaining the conservation work of the zoos themselves, but also for informing work with free living wildlife. So it is really tough, because a lot of people now, which I'm really pleased to see, a lot of people want to get into wildlife conservation and conservation veterinary work. And all I can suggest is that you get yourself known amongst the wildlife disease veterinary professionals. So join things like the Wildlife Disease Association, the American Association of Zoo and Wildlife Veterinarians, the British Veterinary Zoological Society, and so on, and go to conferences, and don't just sit in conferences and listen and then go away again, but actually go up to people, talk to them, tell them you're interested, ask them about openings, volunteer. You know, if you're in practice, find out where your local zoo is, and even if you're not, your practice doesn't cover that zoo, see if you can volunteer there with permission of the practice that does cover that zoo. Or better still, if they've got their own veterinary practice in the zoo, like London and Whipsnade do, then see if you can volunteer there. Or with if people are working with free living wildlife, then talk to them about that. But I must confess, it's not very glamorous most of the time. A lot of the time it's just sat at your computer and going through lots of data and spreadsheets. So you might think it's riding shotgun with a dart gun, but it's not. Most of the time it's just boring old desk work. But it is a very fulfilling job when you can see that you make a real difference.
Maybe not glamorous, but very vital. Just to kind of finish off back on our topic then, I wanted to ask you what's happening next. I know that you've been involved, some of those steps that the recommendations and things like that you mentioned earlier of the things that need to happen. Are any of these suggested measures being actioned to your knowledge? What's sort of the next steps for protecting the global population against these zoonoses?
Yeah, so interestingly, there's a number of universities now that are looking to increase the training and the research that they do in this area, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be the case worldwide. Now, that's hopefully largely due to altruism and wanting to try and do something to stop zoonotic emergence or to be able to deal with zoonotic emergence when it happens. A lot of it will also be due to chasing research funding. And I do hope that research funding increases markedly in this area, because one of the issues that we've had, people like me who carry out research in this area, is that you'll go to one funder and they'll say, oh, we only fund human disease, this is wildlife. You'll go to another funder and say, oh, we only fund wildlife conservation, this is disease. And you'll go to the animal disease funder and they'll say, oh, we only fund livestock disease, this is wildlife. And so these organizations, these funding organizations really need to get their acts together and develop a funding stream that addresses this area. And interestingly, I have been invited recently to attend a meeting with one of the UK's main funders in this area to talk about that. So that's hopeful. I was invited to give a talk to an all-party parliamentary group of MPs, and they seemed quite interested in what I had to say, and I'm hoping that might lead onto something. And ZSL itself is working very hard. This is actually something that's been underway for about 2 years. So long before COVID emerged, but hopefully COVID has given it an extra kick. We're working very hard with our partners at University College London and the Royal Veterinary College to bring together a joint venture which covers biodiversity, livestock and domestic animal health, and social sciences, medical sciences, and conservation. So that we want to develop this, we want to try and develop a centre for biodiversity and public health, because I think just developing a centre for zoonoses misses the point. Biodiversity is really where the issue lies. And that's one of the reasons that I think rewilding is possibly one of the best things that we can do to help not only heal our planet, but decrease the risks of zoonotic emergence in the future.
Fantastic. It's really interesting to see how biodiversity, supporting wildlife, goes hand in hand with supporting kind of a healthy human population as well. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's been a fantastic, very, very informative talk. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge with us. And thank you to everybody else, everybody that's out there watching, for joining us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed this talk. This is just one of the benefits, an example of one of the benefits you can receive as part of the ZSL Fellowship Program. It's been lovely to have you along with us this evening. ZSL Fellowship is at the heart of what ZSL does, and it does include a host of bonuses, including talks like this one, which will continue on throughout the rest of the year, access to our 2 world-leading zoos, and also the ZSL Library, which is an amazing place and one of the largest zoological libraries in the world, which is a fantastic place to go and visit if you ever get a chance to. Fellowships start from £44, and we would love for you to join us. Some of you may have seen recently that one of our ZSL Fellows, Sir David Attenborough, has lent his support to our recent fundraising campaign to help ZSL during this challenging time. As I'm sure you guys are aware, lockdown has impacted ZSL's global activities, including our ongoing scientific research, which you can see from tonight's talk is more important than ever now in helping us to combat the increasing future challenges that will be faced by wildlife and people. We are incredibly grateful for any support you might be able to give, so do visit www.zsl.org if you are able. Never before has your support meant so much to us here. Once again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and providing all your fantastic questions. A video of this talk, it has been recorded and will be available for future viewings for all those who missed this evening or anyone that wants to watch it again. And we really look forward to welcoming you all in future to a future talk or on site at our zoos. So thank you so much, and I'll say good evening and goodbye.